Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of AACRAO's Credential Chats. Today, we are joined by two awesome practitioners from the University of Florida. We have Dr. Rob Moore, Assistant Professor of Educational Technology at University of Florida, and Dr. Kent Crippen, Professor of STEM Education, University of Florida. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. Something that is pretty exciting for Credential Chats is not just having two guests instead of one to mix things up from normal, but also just sort of the kind of landscape perspective that you all bring. You are co-editing the forthcoming two-volume Springer book, Mapping the STEM Micro-Credential Landscape. And, just by way of introduction, maybe just preview, for this two-volume book that you're co-editing. I mean, how many chapters are you doing, and what are some of the things you're already seeing just, in this landscape?
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so Dr. Crippen and I have been kind of collaborating, thinking about STEM micro-credentials for, I would say, probably about 2 or 3 years now. And one of the challenges that we were seeing was that while we could see the vision, we could see the potential, when we were going to external agencies, they were missing some of that. They wanted to see more literature, they wanted to see more context. And we were kind of in this position where we want the funding to show the context. The funders want us to show more of the trajectory, right? So Dr. Tripp and I kind of put our heads together and decided, well, what better way to fill a literature gap but to create a space for that? So that's what we endeavored to do with the book. Originally, we had scoped it out. We were hoping for, I think, maybe 15 or 18 chapters, that we thought we could kind of start laying that, mapping that ecosystem, the landscape of STEM micro-credentials. We put the call out and it absolutely exploded. And we ended up with, I think we had, what was it, like 47, 48 submissions. So many so that we had to go back to the publisher and say, hey, what do we do? Because we were having a really hard time narrowing it down, right? Because we thought we were going to lose a perspective. So we ultimately are with two volumes right now. The first volume is really kind of laying the foundation. So it's looking at frameworks. It's what is a STEM micro credential? What are some of the underlying taxonomies? And then in the second volume, it's really, okay, based off these frameworks, what are those use cases? What are those case studies and how it's being used? So we've been pretty pleased with what the diversity that we're seeing, because we're having everything from higher ed administrators to researchers to practitioners and everything in between, and really coming together. So we're really excited to see where this will go once we.
If I add briefly, the intent of the book is really to both drive research and practice. So Rob and I definitely come at it from a research lens, but recognizing there's a ton of practice around this. So initially when we started talking about the book, it was trying to understand, what is this phenomenon that's happening? What do we know? How do we understand it? Those kinds of things. And as we get into it, and Rob is the one who clearly lives in the micro-credential space, he's often dealing with my questions about how does this connect to workforce development, areas that I'm used to working in. And he would talk about it, but also in describing it would say, we don't really know a whole lot. A lot of it's through conversation. There's not a formal go-to spot for it. So the other part of the book is to try to bring together research and practice and give a spot for people to go to kind of learn what's been done, what's state of the art, and then to think about how can I look at transferable elements to my context, or if I'm a researcher, what are next level research questions that are ready to go, and how do we move this whole area of work forward in a positive way.
There's just so much to unpack there. I think that, and coming from that AACRAO perspective, I can share that, conversations around frameworks, that what you said you're kind of leading with in that first volume is some of the highest interest stuff. And I think where that kind of dovetails is almost in a way an intersection of what provoked, what it sounds like what provoked this book chapter in the first place is, before in higher ed, we do things, a lot of times the first question is, well, what does the research say? And I'm just kind of curious, your perspectives as researchers, not to get too meta there, of how do we navigate this balance of, getting ready versus getting started when we need to know what the research says, but, we don't necessarily already have the research.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, and this again historically goes back to initial conversations with Rob, and sort of asking what's guiding the work that people are doing. Are they thinking about adult learning models? Are they focused on practical problems? Are they do they see an opportunity in some ways to try to understand how they're conceptualizing the problem and the ways in which they're trying to understand and interpret it? All of which is another way of saying we're trying to understand frameworks, right? Frameworks for how you design, frameworks for how you understand, frameworks for how you build some of these ideas into a predefined structure. And so I think for people that aren't familiar with the frameworks idea, we're really trying to focus in on the ways people are conceptualizing the work, how that conceptualization then fits with existing theories or not, and then how it translates into specific design features like within a course, connected to a program, perhaps connected to outreach activities, so that we can start to draw bigger inferences across about what might be happening.
And also, I mean, I've been to Convergence, I've been to UpC, I've been to Badge Summit, and we're seeing some really exciting work that's being done. But the problem is that it's kind of contained. Like the people who are at the conferences know who the movers and shakers are in this space, but the greater higher education landscape doesn't have it, doesn't really have that perspective, and doesn't have that knowledge. So part of this is that we were like, hey, can we use the Springer as a way to platform what some of these amazing work that's being done at these other schools, and move this from being like an isolated, only happening within the micro-credential landscape, but making it so other institutions can look at it. So that's what we're really looking to try to do in those use cases. And talking to some colleagues, that's what a lot of them have said. It's great knowing what the frameworks are and other things, but how has it been used? What are they doing with it?
Yeah.
What are the implications? So that's what we're really focusing on in that second volume is, okay, tell us what it looks like. Tell us what your problem was on your campus. Tell us what your resources are. Because that's the other thing. Everyone has different resources, different level of buy-in. So we want to sort of hopefully make it so that other schools could look at this and say, oh, I didn't realize that Kennesaw State or University of Maryland, Baltimore County, or whatever, or Wichita State, these schools that are doing stuff, like I see the press release, right, about what they're doing, but let's read more detailed, like what
Yeah.
does it look like, so that maybe we can make some decisions and we can make some recommendations for our own institutions going forward.
So I think the answer to your question, though, about what's exciting, one way that I would describe it is not just the case study notion, but it's the way people have approached case study. And so we see case study focused on specific learners or specific topics. We see case studies focused at different scales, which is to say we see them within a department, we see them across colleges, we see them at institution and across institutions. So I think in what we're seeing in the chapters with case study is we see case study representing topics, scale in all these different ways that hopefully people will see something that transfers to their context, informs what their research or practice is all about.
And I just really appreciate, just the notion of approaching this book as Rob, I heard you use the word to platform them, that I think that really just jives with kind of just the whole, orientation of the history of the, open recognition and open badge kind of movement of really, platforming and shining light on people and achievements and accomplishments. And that, I also hear you, Dr. Crippen, describing, that it's not so much a search for the right way, so much as, shining light on case studies that light many potential right ways and dive into the specifics of how they did it so that, as other people are trying to figure out what is the right way for them and their learning community, they can have more context than just, well, this is how this institution's doing it. But to your point of they did it with these resources. And so you're able to kind of have apples to apples and maybe find things that are going to be achievable based off of things that twin to your own context. Another thing I'm just sort of wondering is you talk about, that there was this lack of a lot of formal academic research in this space where people say, well, what does the research say? As you've gotten more familiar with it through the process of co-editing this book, what are some just research interests that you're already realizing are, some additional questions that you're really excited for other people to be answering? And, just in full transparency, I think about, that a lot of the people who are watching this are going to be people who have people in their offices who are doing master's work or doctoral work and may be interested in being the ones who answer some of these questions through the work that, is not theoretical, but actually being led out of their offices right now.
Well, I'll start briefly. I'll draw on what you just described and the way you sort of illustrated the importance of context. And so I think one big research question I see is that whole idea of how is context influencing, what happens with micro-credentials, and then subsequently what that means for learners in that space. And I think because context can be so important, it dictates what's available, the choices, who the learners are, what their goals are. And so I think we're not necessarily, at least I'm not necessarily thinking about big generalizable things from this, but really understanding how those pieces fit together in order to support people, moving towards whatever career goals that they have, in order to, have outcomes that are important to them.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. One of the big things that I'm seeing, both in the conversations, what the chapters we just had, the chapters were just submitted, so we're currently going through the peer review process right now, and it's been really interesting seeing the feedback from the other authors to each other to sort of get a sense for it. And I think one of the things is there's a lot of eureka moments that are happening where it's like, oh, I had no idea you were doing this, or you know what, I had the same kind of issue, or I really like the way you presented this. So I think what I'm hoping is that the answer to your question comes up once we finish the book, right? Like once we get this all mapped out, because right now we still have it in different pieces, and we'll start to see things. I think Dr. Crippen's point about looking at the learner needs are going to be really important. I think higher ed just has to sort of, we're seeing something similar to what happened with online education like 20, 25 years ago, where there was a few kind of institutions that were out in the forefront that were willing to do it, and a lot of institutions like, we don't really think that's what the space we want to do. And eventually, it got to the point now where we're seeing now where people are getting online degrees, and you don't bat an eyelash at it. I think micro credentials are on a similar trajectory where it's going to become more the norm as opposed to like the outlier. So I think we're starting to see what that looks like. One of the things that we're seeing, that I'm seeing a lot, is a lot more collaboration. So even though we do have some silos, we are seeing some more institutional approaches, where it's not just Dr. Crippen and I work in the School of Teaching and Learning, but there's committees being formed that has someone from our extension office, the registrar's office. So institutions are starting to see this as not a single content, right, but more of an institutional policy. So I think that's going to lead to greater implementation and potentially look at some barriers that will come up with that.
Well, and I know that type of, reaching across the aisle, sort of, one big team in institutional ecosystem is a big part of the work that AACRAO is leading, along with folks like, organizations like AACRAO, EDUCAUSE, One Ed Tech, all of these other higher ed organizations. I know we're kind of out of time, but you did touch on one thing that I just wanted to quickly ask. You are at an R1 institution and you're using words like workforce readiness, in the same sentence. And so I just, just briefly, what is it, in your mindset or maybe at your institutional mindsets where, that these two things that at a lot of campuses are not necessarily, things that we can openly talk about is being in sync with one another as far as our mission and goals of how we're serving our learning populations of being an R1 academic institution and focused on learning records that are going to help people access their successful futures. What sort of is that sort of leap that seems to make that okay at a University of Florida?
I think one of them is the capacity we have in the College of Education and the fact that we see education as bigger than K-12 education. It's clearly important. We have a lot of faculty that do work in that area, but we also have faculty that are doing work across the lifespan in spaces that aren't connected to formal education. And I think that's where this comes from, and part of what I think are our unique characteristics. So when we have faculty who are doing research related to that, who have backgrounds in curriculum development and learning that describes the adult experience as well as the young people experience, we have the capacity. And then I would add to that, there's also there's a culture of collaboration here. So drawing a little bit on what you were talking about earlier, working with folks across campus, Rob had also mentioned this, where we see our work not just within the college, we see it clearly in collaboration with others. These are the things that people care about, trying to connect with students, helping them to connect with careers, be successful, et cetera. And there's a role for research and practice in that from the College of Ed side, in our opinion.
And one of the things too, that to piggyback on that, I mean, I haven't looked at the recent numbers, but the last time I looked, there were something like over 26 million Americans over the age of 25 have some college no credential. So clearly the traditional four-year institution residential on campus for 120 hours doesn't really work for everyone. We have a growing population that's that's sort of in the in-between stage, right? Because we're seeing that more of the STEM workforce careers require a higher level of education, expertise, talent, skills that are needed. And getting it through a four-year degree may not necessarily be the right fit. So even though we are at an R1 institution, we are still interested in preparing our learners and being at the forefront of education to ensure that there's a good alignment between that STEM workforce and what's happening in the STEM education classes. So trying to figure out what that is, whether it's MOOCs, whether it's micro-credentials, whether it's hybrid instruction, all these different things. We're always experimenting, trying to figure out what that next best thing is that will allow us to help these learners at various stages of their life reach the goals that they're trying to accomplish.
Well, I definitely appreciate you both indulge me in that last question and for going a little bit over time with me, Dr. Crippen, Dr. Moore, University of Florida. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll definitely look forward to mapping the STEM micro-credential landscape volumes 1 and 2 forthcoming. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a badge-worthy week, everybody.